October 4th, 1996, Mount Rainier National Park, Washington. You're finishing your last shift at the historic Paradise Inn. The summer crowds are long gone. Winter is setting in like a heavy blanket. At 43 years old, you're starting over, a former Peace Corps volunteer and recent divorcee who came to this remote corner of Washington seeking something clean, something new beneath the iconic presence of Mount Rainier. Tomorrow, you'll move down the mountain to work as a housekeeper at the National Park Inn in Longmire. A new job, a new beginning, away from whatever shadows you've been running from. You share a quiet dinner with coworkers and then return to your room for the night. Your slippers sit nice and tidy beside the bed, your belongings organized with the meticulous care that everyone has always noticed about you. Everything is in its place. But as you prepare for sleep in the growing darkness, you don't know that someone is watching you. Someone knows your routines, your fears, your desperate need to stay hidden. By Sunday morning, your bed will remain unslept in, and you'll have vanished into the mountain wilderness that was supposed to be your sanctuary. Because in Mount Rainier National Park, the terrain is built for disappearances, but eventually the snow melts and the past. Mount Rainier National Park, May 1979. Mount Rainier is a landscape of absolute contrast. Subalpine meadows of wildflowers that give way to the grinding blue ice of the powerful glaciers. It's a place that draws the adventurous, but in May 1979, it became the site of a disappearance that remains one of the most unnerving cold cases in the Pacific Northwest. Elaine Marie Robertson was a 24-year-old probation officer from California with a master's degree and a love for the open road. Following a personal breakup, she packed her Volkswagen camper van and headed north to Washington for a solo Memorial Day weekend. She was experienced, sensible, and scheduled to be back at her desk in San Luis Obispo on May 31st, but she never made it. The mystery of Elaine's disappearance is defined by a 40-mile gap that investigators still can't seem to bridge. On May 26th, her VW van was found abandoned on the mountain highway in Elk Plain, Washington. The battery was dead. The van sat silent on the shoulder of the road, but Elaine wasn't there. So the next evening, 40 miles to the southeast, Elaine emerged from the tree line at the Sunshine Point campground, right on the edge of Mount Rainier National Park. She wasn't alone, she was accompanied by her two dogs. But the woman who walked into the camp wasn't the composed professional her friends knew. Witnesses described her as quote-unquote incoherent, soaking wet and shivering from the mountain cold. Two kind-hearted campers gave her some food, a change of clothes, and loaned her a tent for the night. But when those campers woke up the next morning, well, the tent was empty. Elaine and her dogs were gone. They vanished into the morning mist of the Nisqually River Valley. She left behind her personal books, her oil painting supplies, and the very tent that kept her warm. She and her animals had disappeared into the wilderness. The initial search party, it was pretty serious for the time. Nearly 100 volunteers, tracking dogs, and helicopters scoured the rugged terrain all around the river. Park officials eventually called off that search on June 4th, suggesting she might have simply hitched a ride out of the park. But 45 years have passed, and not a single trace of Elaine or her dogs has ever been found. No clothing, no remains, and no sightings. Modern investigators, including Detective Sergeant Elaine Anderson of the Pierce County Sheriff's Department, they look at the case through a much darker lens. They point to the 1970s as the golden age of serial killers in Washington. This was a time when predators stalked the highway corridors leading into the wilderness. And the theory is that Elaine may have encountered a monster while hitchhiking between her broken-down van and the mountain, Or perhaps the person who helped her at the campground wasn't the only one watching her. So as the years had passed, nature itself has conspired to keep the secret. In November 2006, a catastrophic flood saw the Nisqually River reclaim the Sunshine Point campground. It's gone now. 18 inches of rain washed the entire site away, basically destroying the last physical crime scene where Elaine was seen alive. Today, the case of Elaine Marie Robertson is a race against time. The witnesses from 1979 are aging, and the forest has grown over the trails she once walked. Investigators are still holding out for that one minor detail. Someone who saw a woman and two dogs on the road 40 years ago that might finally provide a map to where Elaine's journey truly ended. Mount Rainier National Park, October 1996. When the summer season winds down at Mount Rainier, the crowds thin out, and a heavy, damp silence settles over the old-growth forests of the national park. For 43-year-old Sheila Kearns, this transition was supposed to be a fresh start. A former Peace Corps volunteer and a recent divorcee, Sheila had arrived at the park in August to work the front desk at the historic Paradise Inn. She was basically starting over, looking for a life that was clean and fresh beneath the iconic presence of the mountain. As the Paradise Inn prepared to close its doors for the winter on October 1st, Sheila stayed on, hired to move down the mountain to the National Park Inn at Longmire to work as a housekeeper. She was a woman remembered for her clear eyes, her long dark hair, and an incredibly spiritual nature. But her coworkers also noticed something else. Sheila was always on edge, like anxious. She was meticulous, careful to a fault, and moved with the constant nagging fear that something or someone from her past was going to catch up to her. On Friday evening, October 4th, 1996, Sheila shared a final meal with her friends and coworkers. It was a typical, quiet evening. She was scheduled to report for her new shift at Longmire on Sunday, but when Sunday morning came, she never showed up. When rangers eventually checked her room, they found a scene that felt frozen in time. Her bed was unslept in, her slippers were tucked beside the mattress, her car was still in its spot, and all of her personal belongings, her wallet, her ID, the very things she would need to start a new life, were undisturbed. There was no note, no sign of a struggle, and no Sheila. A 3-day search followed, with rangers and tracking dogs scouring the steep, timbered slopes around Longmire. But in October, the mountain is unpredictable. The clouds dropped low, and the first winter snows began to bury the trails. The search was called off, and for 7 months, Sheila Kearns was simply a name on a missing person poster. The mystery took a grim turn on May 10th, 1997. A volunteer setting up a navigation course near the old Longmire campground spotted something in the brush. It was Sheila's remains, scattered over about a 300-yard area, less than a mile from where she was supposed to be working. The discovery forced the National Park Service and the FBI to reconsider everything. Initially, some wondered if she'd been a victim of a cougar attack, the kind of sudden violent encounter that can happen in the Rainier backcountry, but the forensic evidence didn't fit. Sheila was incredibly careful. She wasn't the type to wander off trail in the dark, especially given her palpable fear of being followed. By March 1998, federal authorities made it official. Sheila's death was being investigated as a homicide. They believed she'd been abducted, plucked from the safety of the park's employee housing by someone who knew her movements. The FBI sent a number of items of evidence to their lab in D.C., and while they interviewed numerous suspects, every lead eventually withered. Today, the case of Sheila Kearns remains one of the most haunting shadows over Mount Rainier. For the people who worked with her, the area around Longmire hasn't felt the same since 1996. They speak of a sinister aura that lingers near the old campground, a feeling that the mountain is holding on to some dark secret. Sheila's mother, Olive, passed away without ever knowing who took her daughter. The FBI still offers a $20,000 reward for the missing piece of the puzzle. That one person from Sheila's past on her final days who knows exactly what happened after she stepped out of her room that Friday night. Until then, Sheila remains the housekeeper of Longmire, a woman who came to the mountain to escape her past, only to find that some shadows are long enough to reach even the highest peaks. Mount Rainier National Park, January 1st, 2012. New Year's Day at Mount Rainier is typically a scene of quiet. Hundreds of families head to the Paradise area to go sledding, snowshoeing, or to take in the views of the 14,000-foot peak that dominates the Pacific Northwest skyline. But as the sun rose on the first morning of 2012, a darkness was already speeding toward the park from the lowlands of Seattle. At 10:20 a.m., a blue vehicle blew past a mandatory tire chain checkpoint near Longmire. It was a routine violation, but the man behind the wheel was anything but routine. 24-year-old Benjamin Colton Barnes was an Iraq War veteran who, just 8 hours earlier, had allegedly opened fire at a New Year's Eve party in Skyway, wounding 4 people. He was armed, volatile, and heading straight for the crowded visitor centers at the top of the mountain. Ranger Margaret Anderson, a 34-year-old mother of 2, was the first to respond. She didn't know anything about the shooting in Skyway. She only knew that a vehicle was defying park regulations and potentially endangering other drivers. Margaret performed a textbook maneuver, positioning her patrol SUV sideways across both lanes at a spot known as Barn Flats to block the suspect's path. As Barnes approached the roadblock, he did not slow down. He performed a sharp U-turn, jumped out of his car, and immediately opened fire with a high-powered semi-automatic assault rifle. Margaret was struck while behind the wheel. A second ranger, Dan Kamisha, arrived seconds later and was met with a hail of battlefield-grade gunfire. Bullets punched through his windshield in a 4 corners pattern around his head, narrowly missing him. Outgunned and under fire, Kamisha was forced to retreat in reverse just to survive. Because Barnes had taken a tactical position behind high snowbanks and continued to fire at anything that moved, rescue teams couldn't reach Margaret for 90 minutes. When a Pierce County SWAT team finally used a ballistic shield to reach her vehicle, it was too late. Margaret Anderson, who'd spent her career protecting the park's visitors, had become the first ranger in Mount Rainier's history to be killed in the line of duty. The shooting triggered an immediate lockdown. At the Jackson Visitor Center, 125 tourists and 17 staff members were herded down into the basement. Unarmed interpretive rangers turned the building into a fortress, searching visitors for weapons and bracing for a mass casualty event. Outside, a massive 24-hour manhunt began. Over 200 officers from the FBI, State Patrol, and local SWAT teams converged on the park. They used heat-sensing technology in armored vehicles to track a man they knew was wearing heavy body armor and carrying an arsenal that included an AR-15 and an AK-47. Despite his military training, Barnes was unprepared for the mountain's ultimate defense. He fled into the deep snow, 4 to 5 feet deep in some places, wearing only a t-shirt, jeans, and 1 tennis shoe. As temperatures plummeted below freezing, the hunter became the hunted. SWAT teams followed his post hole tracks through the drifts until the trail went cold. Then, on the morning of January 2nd, a fixed-wing aircraft spotted a figure lying face down in the Paradise River. Barnes hadn't died in a final blaze of glory. He'd succumbed to the mountain itself, dead from hypothermia in the icy water. The legacy of the Barn Flats ambush is one of both tragedy and profound heroism. Margaret Anderson was supposed to be in her final year at Rainier. She and her husband, Eric, also a ranger, were planning to move closer to family and start a new chapter. Instead, she became the shield that protected the mountain. Investigators later found a massive stash of magazines and survivalist gear in Barnes's car. Pierce County detectives were blunt in their assessment. if Margaret hadn't stopped him at Barn Flats, Barnes would have reached the Paradise parking lot where hundreds of unsuspecting families were playing in the snow. Ranger Anderson gave her life to ensure that a New Year's Day tragedy didn't become a massacre. Today, her badge remains a symbol of the thin green line that stands between the beauty of our national parks and the urban violence that occasionally and tragically spills into the wilderness. Blinding snow and freezing temperatures before losing consciousness. When a Navy helicopter crew finally spotted him the following afternoon, Lipinski was a literal block of ice. His body temperature had plummeted to 70 degrees Fahrenheit. By the time he reached the ER at Harborview Medical Center in Seattle, his heart had stopped. For 45 minutes, Michael Lipinski was clinically dead. His survival became an international headline, a medical miracle fueled by a cutting-edge technology known as ECMO. The machine essentially acted as his heart and lungs, pulling his blood out, oxygenating it, and pumping it back in, while doctors worked to restart his own frozen heart. His medical team noted that the extreme hypothermia from the mountain had actually protected his brain, slowing his metabolism enough to prevent permanent damage during those 45 minutes of silence. 2 days after his heart stopped, Lipinski opened his eyes. By day 8, he walked out of the hospital. In emotional media interviews, he spoke of a profound spiritual shift. "I owe society a lot," he told reporters, promising to spend his bonus time on Earth dedicated to service and charity. For a brief moment, he was the ultimate symbol of human resilience and the triumph of science over the elements. But the quote-unquote bonus time Michael Lipinski was granted took a dark and violent turn. 4 years after the mountain tried to claim him, Lipinski's name reappeared in the headlines, not as a survivor, but as a defendant. In November 2024, Lipinski was arrested and charged with second-degree murder. The high-profile Miracle Man was accused of a cold-blooded execution in a Safeway parking lot in Bothell, Washington. Prosecutors alleged that Lipinski arranged a meeting to buy $1,900 worth of methamphetamine and fentanyl. According to court documents, the victim entered Lipinski's SUV where he was shot to death. Lipinski then allegedly dumped the man's body in the middle of the parking lot and fled. The investigation took a final damning turn when Lipinski's roommate told police that Lipinski had confessed to the killing, reportedly stating, "I shot him. I did it." Prosecutors, arguing that Lipinski poses a significant danger to the community, pointed out the chilling irony. A man whose life was saved by a multi-million-dollar medical effort was willing to end another person's life over less than $2,000. Recently, Michael Lipinski has sat in the Snohomish County Jail on a $1 million bond. The soft-spoken hiker who once gave a thumbs up from a hospital bed now faces decades in prison. His story has become a stark dichotomy, a journey that began with a heroic rescue in the sub-freezing reaches of Mount Rainier and ended in the violent reality of a suburban drug trade. Mount Rainier gave Michael Lipinski his life back, but it couldn't change who he was, a cold-blooded killer. 4 stories, 1 mountain, and 4 reminders that Mount Rainier is more than just a landmark. It's a witness. From the vanishing of Elaine Robertson to the battlefield ambush of Margaret Anderson, the high peaks of the Cascades hold secrets that are sometimes recovered and sometimes buried forever under the ice.